The day the prisoners of Northgate Penitentiary humiliated Officer Daniel Carter, he didn't fight back. Not in the way they expected, anyway. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't throw a punch, he didn't even file a report filled with the hollow indignation of a man seeking institutional justice he knew would never come. He waited. He watched. He let the echoes of their howling laughter become a part of him, a cold, dark fuel stored deep within his soul. And when Warden Hayes finally froze in the middle of that sterile administrative hallway, a statue carved from pure, unadulterated panic, Carter realized it was far, far too late for any of them to understand the war they had started. The warden stood there, a man drowning on dry land, his eyes locked on the officer he had so casually sacrificed, and in that silent, screaming moment, he understood that his world had just ended. Carter, however, felt nothing but the quiet, satisfying click of the final piece of a grand, terrible machine locking into place. This is a story about a system rotted from the inside out, a sprawling concrete kingdom ruled by a symbiotic partnership of inmate corruption and administrative cowardice. It's about the insidious fear that seeps into the mortar and steel, poisoning guards and convicts alike. This is the story of how one man, stripped of his dignity and publicly broken, refused to shatter. Instead, he gathered the scattered pieces of his professional identity and reforged them into a weapon. He used the prison's own unwritten rules, the whispers, the paranoia, the fragile loyalties, and the dirty secrets, to methodically, silently, and completely tear it all down. This is a story about a psychological war fought not in a sun-drenched yard with fists and shivs, but in the echoing cell blocks and shadowed corridors of the human mind, where the only weapon that truly mattered was the one they never saw him carrying. What truly happens when a respected American officer, a man who has built his entire life on a foundation of control and professionalism, is publicly broken by the very prisoners he's supposed to control? Does he simply shatter into a million pieces, another casualty of a broken system? Or does he absorb the shock, transmute the shame into focus, and become something far more dangerous? Does he fight back not with rage, but with intellect, using their own minds as the battlefield and their own secrets as the ammunition? For 8 long years, Daniel Carter had walked the line at Northgate Penitentiary. To him, the prison wasn't just a place of work. It was an entity, a living, breathing creature of brutalist architecture, a fortress of concrete and steel that baked under the relentless glare of the summer sun and shivered in the biting winter wind. It was a place of oppressive horizontals and verticals, where even the sky seemed caged by the high walls topped with glittering concertina wire. He wasn't a hard case, not one of the guards who seemed to feed on the toxic atmosphere, their personalities sharpened into cruel points by the daily friction of confrontation and intimidation. He was the opposite. He was quiet, almost unnaturally so, an observant man who seemed to possess the uncanny ability to blend into the gray, peeling walls of the institution. He treated the inmates, from the fresh-faced petty thieves to the hardened, hollow-eyed murderers, with a detached, almost clinical professionalism. He learned their names, their sentences, and their tells, not out of any personal curiosity, but as a biologist might study a volatile ecosystem. In the violent, chaotic world of the prison, a world that ran on a constant, low-frequency hum of potential explosion, that calm predictability had earned him a strange, grudging measure of respect. He was Officer Carter. Fair, but firm. Unflappable. Or so everyone, including Carter himself, had come to believe, forgetting that even the strongest wall will crumble if the right pressure is applied consistently and in the perfect spot. The prison itself was a living, breathing pressure cooker, and the air was thick with its exhalations. You could feel the tension in every molecule, a toxic mix of stale sweat, the sharp, chemical tang of industrial disinfectant that failed to mask the underlying smell of decay, and the simmering, acidic resentment of 1,000 caged men. A rigid, informal hierarchy, more powerful and more strictly enforced than any official regulation printed in a state-issued handbook, governed the population with an iron fist. At the absolute apex of this brutal food chain was an inmate named Silas. He wasn't the biggest or the physically strongest man in the yard. His power was far more sophisticated and far more terrifying. Silas possessed a venomous charisma, a silken voice that could soothe or incite, and a cunning, predatory ability to read and exploit the weaknesses, fears, and desires of everyone around him, inmate and guard alike. His power wasn't in his fists. It was in his absolute control of information, of contraband, of the intricate and invisible web of favors and debts that made the prison truly run. He was a spider at the center of a vast, sticky web, and he knew whenever even the smallest strand trembled. It was a system of influence that, Carter would later learn with chilling certainty, ran deeper and higher than any inmate should have ever been able to reach, extending far beyond the prison walls and into the halls of power itself. That hard-won reputation for being unflappable was precisely what made Officer Carter a target. For a man like Silas, whose entire identity was built on dominance and control, the quiet, unshakable officer was an anomaly, an insult, a living challenge to his carefully constructed authority. To the other guards, Carter was a professional. To the other inmates, he was a known quantity. But to Silas, Carter was a piece on the board that didn't move according to the established rules, and that made him an intolerable threat. Breaking Officer Carter would be more than just a personal victory. It would be a coronation, a bloody and spectacular demonstration to every inmate and every guard that no one, absolutely no one, was beyond his reach. He began his campaign not with a bang, but with a series of whispers, a subtle poisoning of the very air Carter breathed. Conversations that would abruptly halt the moment Carter rounded a corner, replaced by a charged, knowing silence. Muffled laughter from a cell block that he was clearly the punchline of. Small, coordinated acts of noncompliance, a dozen inmates simultaneously refusing to move, only to acquiesce a moment later with mocking smiles. It was classic psychological warfare, a death by 1,000 cuts, meticulously designed to unnerve, to isolate, and to create the first hairline cracks in the unyielding armor of his professionalism. Carter recognized the tactics for what they were, a primitive but effective form of mental attrition. He made a conscious, and ultimately fatal, decision to ignore them. He believed that showing no reaction, offering no crack for the chisel to find purchase, was the ultimate sign of strength. And that was his first and most critical mistake. The humiliation, when it finally arrived, was not a random act of prison violence. It was a public spectacle, a symphony of sadism, a masterpiece of calculated cruelty designed for maximum psychological impact. It unfolded during the midday meal in the main mess hall, a cavernous, deafening room packed with 200 inmates and a half-dozen of his colleagues, the air thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and simmering animosity. Through a new, gullible guard named Peterson, a young man eager to be seen as friendly by the population, Silas had learned Carter's deepest, most irrational secret, a severe, almost phobic fear of spiders that stemmed from a traumatic childhood incident, a story Carter had once shared in confidence during a pre-employment psychological evaluation and had never spoken of again. As Carter walked his patrol route between the long steel tables, his footsteps echoing in the cacophony, a silent signal, a barely perceptible nod from Silas, was given. An inmate, one of Silas's hulking cronies, accidentally stumbled hard into him, a clumsy, dramatic display of apology already on his lips. In the brief, manufactured chaos of the collision, something was dropped down the back of his crisp, buttoned uniform shirt. It was a large, hairy tarantula, a smuggled pet, kept fed and alive for weeks for exactly this kind of psychological terrorism. The second its spindly, bristly legs touched the skin of his back, a horrifying, multi-legged scrabbling against his bare flesh, Carter's 8 years of professional detachment and disciplined control shattered like a pane of glass hit by a wrecking ball. He froze solid, his entire body locking up as a primal, reptilian part of his brain took over. A cold sweat instantly broke across his forehead and the nape of his neck, drenching his collar. The mess hall, which had been roaring with the noise of 100 conversations, fell dead silent. The sudden absence of sound was more shocking than the noise had been, a collective intake of breath creating a vacuum of sound. Every single eye in that vast room, inmate and officer alike, was on him. Then, a single, deliberate laugh from Silas's table broke the spell, and the room erupted. It wasn't just laughter. It was a primal, howling roar of mockery, a wave of derision that washed over Carter with physical force. They were jeering, pointing, pounding the tables, their faces contorted in vicious delight, feeding on the raw, undisguised terror they saw in an officer's eyes. With a strangled gasp that was torn from his throat, Carter clawed at his own shirt, his fingers fumbling clumsily with the buttons before he ripped them open, swatting frantically at his own back to dislodge the creature. His heart was hammering against his ribs as if trying to escape his chest, each beat a painful explosion in his ears. His face burned with a shame so hot and so absolute it felt like a physical fire, scorching him from the inside out. But the worst part, the part that would curdle into a cold, hard knot of pure, unadulterated rage in his gut, wasn't the inmates. He expected their savagery. It was the warden. Warden Hayes, a man whose entire career was built on the public image of order, control, and unwavering discipline, was standing by the main door, a coffee cup in his hand. He had seen the whole thing unfold, from the stumble to the silent signal to the eruption of chaos. He didn't order a lockdown. He didn't dispatch his officers to punish the inmates responsible. He didn't back his officer. He simply waited, his face a mask of annoyance, for the tarantula to be flung to the floor and stomped on by another guard. Then he walked over to the still panting, utterly humiliated Carter. With a look of profound disappointment, he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Carter, get a grip. You're causing a scene." In that one moment, Warden Hayes wasn't just a bystander. He was an accomplice. He had made a calculated decision, choosing the flimsy appearance of order over the actual substance of justice. He had sided with the wolves to keep them from howling too loudly, sacrificing one of his own shepherds to appease the pack. As Carter walked out of that mess hall, his back straight but his spirit in pieces, the sound of derisive, cackling laughter following him like a physical blow, something inside him didn't just shift, it broke. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, and then, in the cold, dark silence of his own mind, those pieces began to reform into something new. Something cold, hard, and terrifyingly patient. There would be no shouting match in the warden's office, no fistfight in the yard, no grievance filed with the union. That's what they wanted. That's what they understood. No, he was going to fight back, but not on their terms, not in their arena. He was going to dismantle their world from the inside out, piece by painstaking piece, using their own tools against them. He was going to fight back on his terms. The game was on. His revenge would not be a flash flood, a sudden and violent outburst of anger. It would be a slow, creeping rot, an invisible infection introduced into the very bloodstream of the corrupt system they had built. Carter's first move was one of strategic disappearance. He became a ghost. The fair but firm officer Carter they knew, the man who engaged, who counseled, who mediated, ceased to exist. He faded into the gray background of the prison, his face a blank, unreadable slate. He performed his duties with a chilling, mechanical efficiency, his voice never rising above a monotone, his eyes revealing nothing, becoming two chips of cold, polished stone. But while his physical and emotional presence diminished to nearly nothing, his observation sharpened to a razor's edge. He started carrying a small, state-approved notebook and a pen, and he began to document everything. Not just incidents, but the spaces between incidents. The quiet moments. The patterns. He didn't just document obvious rule-breaking like a shakedown or a fight. That was amateurish, the work of a snitch. He documented patterns that were invisible to everyone else. The way a certain guard, Miller, a man with a gambling problem, always seemed to have his back turned at precisely 2:15 p.m. when contraband passed hands in the laundry room. The specific times of day, the warden would lock himself in his office and refuse all calls, emerging an hour later looking agitated and wiping sweat from his brow. He noted which inmates spoke to which guards, and for how long. He noted which of Silas's crew had preferential access to kitchen supplies, and cross-referenced it with their cell assignments. He began to map out the entire subtle ecosystem of power, the unwritten constitution of favor and fear that truly ran Northgate. The other guards, seeing his constant, silent scribbling, thought he was cracking up, lost in a world of post-traumatic paranoia after his public breakdown. They pitied him, then ignored him. The inmates, led by Silas's triumphant narrative, saw him as a broken man, a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the halls. It was the perfect cover. He was invisible, and from that position of invisibility, he could see everything. His second move was to weaponize the prison's most abundant natural resource, paranoia. The inmate hierarchy, for all its brutal strength, was built on a surprisingly fragile foundation of trust and loyalty within Silas's inner circle. Carter decided to systematically crack that foundation with a series of carefully placed psychological charges. He noticed one of Silas's key lieutenants, a violent enforcer named Rico with a reputation for explosive jealousy, had a weakness for a particular brand of expensive, black-market coffee. It was a status symbol, a small luxury that separated him from the common population. During a routine cell inspection, one Carter specifically volunteered for, citing a desire to take on more tedious duties, he found a small vacuum-sealed bag of that exact coffee hidden in the cell of a rival gang member. He didn't confiscate it. He didn't report it. He just picked it up, examined it with a thoughtful, curious expression, and placed it back on the shelf, making sure the rival inmate, who was watching from the cell doorway with a confused and nervous expression, saw the entire silent exchange. Then he left without a word, his face a mask of neutrality. Within 24 hours, the whispers in the prison changed direction. They were no longer about Carter's humiliation. They were about who was a rat. 2 inmates got into a bloody fight over an imagined slight, a perceived betrayal. Silas, who ruled through the perception of absolute control and knowledge, now had a seed of potent paranoia planted deep within his own organization. Who was talking to the guards? Who was making side deals? Carter never said a word. He just watched, his face impassive, as Silas's iron-fisted control began to show hairline fractures. He documented the resulting fights, the suspicious glances, the broken alliances in his little notebook. He followed this by misplacing a work roster, leaving it in a common area where it appeared that one of Silas's men was getting preferential treatment, a clear violation of their internal code. The man was beaten severely that evening, another crack in the foundation, another tremor in Silas's kingdom, all while Carter quietly observed from the shadows, the architect of a chaos no one could trace back to him. But the inmates were only the opening act, the pawns in a much larger game. His true, ultimate target was Warden Hayes. Through weeks of relentless obsessive observation and the painstaking cross-referencing of visitor logs, staff schedules, and vehicle license plates, Carter had finally uncovered the warden's dirty secret. It wasn't just a simple case of looking the other way or passive corruption. It was an active, lucrative enterprise. Every second Tuesday of the month, the warden received a private, off-the-books visit from a so-called pro bono lawyer named Arthur Finch. And, like clockwork, every second Wednesday, an inmate from a wealthy family, a man nowhere near eligible for parole, would have his hearing abruptly moved up the docket, often with a favorable recommendation from the warden himself. The pattern was undeniable, a clear and profitable rhythm of corruption. The warden was running a parole-for-pay scheme. The proof, Carter discovered after weeks of watching the warden's private routine, was a black leather-bound ledger the warden kept locked in the bottom right drawer of his desk, which he would only update in the hour immediately after the lawyer left the facility. The warden, growing increasingly agitated by Carter's unnerving calm and his constant, silent presence, started to apply direct and unsubtle pressure. He was a man accustomed to subordinates who were either sycophantic or openly defiant, and Carter's silent obedience was more unnerving than any threat. He assigned Carter to the most grueling, soul-crushing posts the prison had to offer: sewage maintenance in the bowels of the facility, where the stench was so overpowering it clung to him for days, and the graveyard shift in the solitary wing, a place of profound darkness where the screams and mad ramblings of isolated men echoed all night long. He was trying to provoke a reaction, to push Carter until he either quit or lashed out, looking for any excuse to get rid of the ghost that haunted his hallways and seemed to watch him with accusing, empty eyes. But Carter gave him nothing. He performed every degrading duty with a quiet, unnerving resolve that only seemed to escalate the warden's anxiety. In fact, Carter's stoicism began to have an unintended, paradoxical effect. Some inmates, those outside Silas's immediate sphere of influence, began to see him differently. They saw an officer who was publicly shamed by their leader, who was being systematically tormented by the administration, yet refused to break, refused to complain, refused to show weakness. The fear they once had for Silas was slowly being replaced by a curious, wary respect for Carter. He was a man who endured. But the warden was oblivious. He was too consumed by his own growing paranoia. He thought he was cornering a mouse, pushing a broken man to the brink of insanity. He had no idea he was dealing with a patient predator who was simply arranging the final pieces on the board, waiting for the perfect, irrefutable moment to declare checkmate. The final move had to be perfect. It couldn't be a series of attacks. It had to be a single, devastating, decapitating blow that would bring the whole corrupt structure crashing down without Carter ever appearing to have laid a hand on it. He couldn't steal the ledger. That was a crime that would discredit everything he had worked for and likely land him in a cell himself. He had to use the system to expose the system, turning its own mechanisms of oversight against its corrupt leader. After weeks of finalizing his timeline, he had the warden's pattern down to a cold, scientific certainty. He knew the name of the lawyer, Arthur Finch. He knew the exact time of his next visit. Through a cleverly posed, innocent-sounding question to a clerk in the records office about a misfiled document, he even knew which wealthy inmate, a young man convicted of vehicular manslaughter, was next on the golden parole list. He had his checkmate in 3 moves: the tip, the audit, and the witness. From a greasy, flickering payphone at a gas station miles from his home, on his scheduled day off, Carter made a single phone call. He didn't call the local police, who might be in the warden's pocket. He didn't call the media, who would cause a circus and risk the evidence disappearing. He called the one office Warden Hayes couldn't control, intimidate, or buy: the State Department of Corrections Office of Professional Responsibility. He filed an anonymous tip. But it wasn't a vague, hysterical accusation. It was surgically precise. He gave them the lawyer's name. He gave them the inmate's name. And he gave them a date and a 2-hour window for a specific illicit transaction happening the very next day. He told them a large cash deposit was being made to facilitate a fraudulent parole, and that all the evidence of this ongoing scheme, including years of past transactions, was meticulously logged in a black leather-bound ledger book kept in the warden's bottom right desk drawer. The next morning, Carter came into work early, the picture of diligence. He found a younger officer who was scheduled for the administrative block and swapped shifts with him, citing a sudden family emergency that required him to be near a phone, a move so profoundly out of character for the stoic Carter that it raised no suspicion whatsoever. The swap ensured he was assigned to the administrative block, the quiet, carpeted hallway right outside the warden's office. He stood at his post, a silent sentinel, his face as calm and neutral as a stone wall, his heart beating a slow, steady, funereal rhythm. At 10:30 a.m., exactly as Carter had predicted, two stern-faced auditors from the state, a man and a woman in severe gray suits that screamed bureaucratic authority, arrived unannounced at the front gate. They walked past Carter with a curt nod that he returned with equal brevity, and went straight into the warden's office, closing the door firmly behind them. Carter heard the sharp, authoritative tone of their voices, muffled but clear, the sound of an ambush in progress. A few minutes later, Warden Hayes walked out of his office, his face pale and slick with a sudden clammy sweat. He was headed toward his secretary's desk, his movements jerky and panicked. He was almost certainly going to try to hide or destroy the ledger. But then he saw Carter. Carter wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He was just standing there, holding his post, his expression perfectly, terrifyingly neutral. And in that instant, the warden knew. His eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief turning into a tidal wave of raw, animal panic. He saw the entire intricate game laid bare in a horrifying flash of insight. The calculated humiliation in the mess hall, not as a random act of inmate aggression, but as the first move in a war. The officer's strange, silent, ghost-like behavior in the weeks that followed. The meticulous, endless note-taking that everyone had dismissed as madness. The sudden, inexplicable shift-swap that had placed Carter right here, right now, as the sole witness to his downfall. It all clicked into place with the sickening, echoing finality of a cell door slamming shut and locking for the last time. He knew Carter was the anonymous tip. He knew that Carter knew everything. He couldn't destroy the ledger because the auditors were already in his office, likely demanding he open the very drawer it was in. He couldn't fire Carter or have him removed. It would be a screamingly obvious act of retaliation that would only confirm his guilt. He was trapped. Utterly, completely, and hopelessly. His own corruption, the very source of his power and wealth, had become the bars of his cage, and Carter was the silent, impassive guard standing watch. He didn't yell. He didn't move. He just stood there in the middle of the hallway, his gaze locked on Carter, his mouth slightly open as if to speak, but no words came out. All the color drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, grayish white, the color of death. His authority, his power, his carefully curated image, his entire future, it all evaporated in that one, silent, terrible moment of realization. The warden, the man who held the lives and fates of 1,000 men in his hands, was completely and totally paralyzed. He froze. The auditors found the ledger exactly where the anonymous tip had said it would be. The parole for pay scheme was exposed, sparking a statewide investigation that would eventually ensnare 2 judges, a handful of lawyers, and a dozen wealthy families. Warden Hayes was removed in disgrace, his career and reputation shattered beyond repair, traded for a mugshot and a lengthy prison sentence in a facility far from his former kingdom. Inside Northgate, the fallout was immediate and seismic. Silas's power base, which had been propped up by his secret, mutually beneficial arrangement with the corrupt warden, crumbled overnight. Without the warden's protection, his contraband routes dried up and his authority vanished as if it had never existed. The inmate hierarchy, so carefully maintained through fear, was thrown into chaos, forced to rebuild from the ground up in a series of bloody, internal conflicts as new predators vied for the empty throne. Carter was vindicated. He had won. But it was a cold, silent victory, celebrated by no one. He had looked into the abyss of the prison's soul and, instead of recoiling, he had learned its language. He had used its own tactics against it: manipulation, paranoia, and relentless psychological warfare. He fought back not with force, but with a cold, calculated, strategic takedown that left his enemies utterly broken, their minds and worlds dismantled. Justice was, in a way, served. But watching the disgraced Warden being escorted out of the building, a shuffling, broken shell of the man he once was, you have to ask, in the process of fighting monsters, had Officer Carter become something just as cold and calculating himself? Had he sacrificed a part of his own humanity to reclaim his dignity? If this story of calculated revenge left you speechless, smash that like button. Tell us in the comments, was this true justice, or did Carter go too far in his quest for payback? Your perspective matters. And don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss the stories we share here, because sometimes the most brutal battles aren't fought with fists, but with minds.